Hello and welcome to today's lecture. The topic for today's lecture is the sources of stress and how it causes illness. The main objectives of our topic are understanding the concept of stress, gaining knowledge about various sources of stress, delineating the difference between internal and external sources of stress, learning about different categories of external stressors, differentiating between continuous and discrete stressors, learning about the effects of these stressors on our health and well-being, learning about the diversity of stressors and their health consequences, and understanding the relation between stress and illness from different perspectives. Other objectives are learning about the physiological mechanisms related to continuous exposure to stress, learning about the stress-related damages to neurological and other physiological systems of the body, and learning about the association between stress-related physiological mechanisms and different illnesses. Stress is understood as a broad and complex phenomenon characterized by environmental demands, internal physiological processes, and physical outcomes. The extensive research on stress has helped researchers to converge on the following common definition. Stress is a negative emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral changes that are directed either towards altering the stressful event or accommodating its effects. Such an emotional experience enables a person to react to or deal with the events causing stress. Thus, if handled properly, it increases the probability of our survival. At the same time, it has the potential to jeopardize one's health and well-being. The numerous sources of stress in our environment, which might range from routine situations like being caught in a traffic jam to rare situations like experiencing the death of a loved one or the loss of one's house to a fire. The physical or psychological demands from the environment that cause stress are called stressors. Stress depends upon the situation as well as upon the individual's perception of the situation. People react to stressors in different ways. A particular situation may be stressful to one person but may not elicit the same kind of stress from everyone. For example, some students may complete their exams easily without feeling any anxiety, while others may experience the test anxiety every time they take an exam. Thus, stressors are stressful situations inside or outside of one's control. They have been distinguished as external stressors and internal stressors. External stressors are pressures that are placed upon the individual by the outside world. They are usually factors which lie outside of the individual's control. The external sources of stress have been mostly studied under the social stress perspective. External stressors are commonly divided into 5 categories: life events, chronic stressors, daily stressors, trauma, and non-events. The stressors have also been classified into 2 broad categories: discrete and continuous stressors. The life events and trauma are discrete stressors, while chronic and daily stressors are continuous ones. The discrete and chronic stressors are also referred to as quotidian stressors. All of these stressors require a significant amount of adjustment on part of the individual. Life events, also known as life change events or event stressors, are discrete, observable stressor events that have a clear onset and offset. Some examples of life event stressors are the death of a spouse, divorce, moving home, changing schools, or job loss. The amount of disruptive change caused by a significant life event is considered as an important aspect leading to stress than the subject of life event itself. For example, the birth of a child is an enjoyable event but at the same time can be stressful for the newborn's parents. Therefore, even a positive life event which necessitates change in a person's life can lead to stress. The life events and their relationship to stress levels has been the subject of research in the late 1960s when Thomas Holmes and Richard Ray developed the Social Readjustment Rating Scale to measure the amount of overall change experienced by an individual according to life events they have needed to adjust to. Chronic stresses are the persistent or recurrent difficulties of life. They are the continuous stressors in our lives which can be related to social roles, for example, being a caregiver of a sick spouse or a working parent. They can also be outside of such roles and might include such stressors as poverty, chronic illness, living in a noisy and crowded place, or even a war-affected or conflict-ridden region. The ongoing and open-ended nature of a stressor is one of the major characteristics that qualify it as a chronic stressor. It's also difficult to identify when exactly did the chronic stressor begin or when or if it will end. The lack of control over the onset, remission, and resolution of the chronic stressor makes it more debilitating than other kinds of stressors. Wheaton and Montazer provided three defining characteristics of chronic stressors that set them apart from the event stressors. The first, chronic stressors develop slowly and insidiously as continuous problems which may be related to social roles and the social environment. In addition, chronic stressors may or may not start as events. For example, increasing demands in a job versus losing a job. Second, the duration of the stressors from onset to offset is usually longer than the duration of life events. For example, poverty. A chronic stressor is of longer duration than an unfortunate life event like a loss in the business. Now, third, chronic stressors include both regular problems and issues related to daily roles and more specific problems, making them less self-limiting than life events. For example, conflicts in a marriage versus divorce. Daily hassles are defined as relatively minor events arising from day-to-day living, such as daily spousal conflict, specific caregiving activities, and work deadlines. They are small, unexpected, or unanticipated life events that may disrupt one's daily life, for example, having an argument with one's parents, getting a virus in one's computer, or reaching late to the office. The defining characteristics of daily stressors which separate them from chronic stressors are their duration and the magnitude of their severity. The daily inventory of stressful events, DICE, is used by researchers to ascertain information about the frequency of people's daily stressors. The daily hassles and chronic stressors that permeate our daily reality have been evidenced to have the most significant effect on our health and well-being than that of discrete life events. Though the emotional effects of a daily hassle might disappear in a day or two, but it has been shown in several studies that the frequency and type of daily hassles experienced by an individual provides a better explanation for the associated psychological and physical health outcomes than do the major life events in the recent past or the chronic role-related stressors. The frequency of stressor exposure or total number of stressors that an individual experiences is more problematic if the stressors experienced are less diverse. The concept of stressor diversity was discussed by Coffer, Ram, Conray, Pincus, and Almeida in understanding the effect of chronic stress on health. Stressor diversity expresses the degree to which the total stressors are spread across different stressor types. The researchers found that high stressor exposure and low stressor diversity was associated with high negative effect and low positive effect. Stressors can also be categorized as traumatic. Trauma reflects exposure to terrible events generally outside the range of daily human experience that are emotionally painful, intense, and distressing. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, there are specific criteria for what qualifies as a traumatic event. Exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the traumatic event, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. For example, the first responders collecting human remains or the police officers who are repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, etc. Traumatic events result in problematic trauma responses that are unique from general stress responses. In addition to that initial stress response, long-term psychological consequences are seen in many individuals who are exposed to traumas. The psychiatric condition commonly associated with trauma exposure is the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Traumas tend to have a greater impact on long-term health and well-being. Many studies have been done in the Western contexts to understand the experience of trauma in an individual's lifetime. According to Ozrath and the co-workers, most people experience at least one violent or life-threatening situation during their lives. Using the Traumatic Life Events Questionnaire, TLEQ, Ogleet and the co-workers found that non-disclosed childhood physical abuse is the least common trauma, and the unexpected death, illness, or accident involving a loved one is the most common trauma. The last category of external stressors is the non-events. They are the desired or anticipated events and experiences that do not happen in reality. A non-event could be seen as something desirable which does not occur when its occurrence is normative for people of a certain group. Thus, an anticipated promotion that does not occur or not being married at a certain age can be considered non-events. Non-events are similar to chronic stressor, but the main difference is in the normative timing. Normative expectations play an important role in stressfulness of non-events, such as not getting married by a certain age or not getting an anticipated promotion at a certain stage in the career. In addition to external stressors that lie in our environment, there are internal stressors that lie inside of our psychological makeup. Internal stressors are related to personality traits and temperament. Internal stressors are pressures which the person places upon himself. They usually lie within the control of the individual. Internal stressors may include, among others, the following: having unrealistic expectations about oneself, world, and others, negative attitudes and perceptions, poor self-discipline and unhealthy lifestyle, type A behavior patterns, etc. Internal stressors can usually be tackled with appropriate coaching, training, or therapy. Even when a person cannot control the situation, they can control how they interpret and react to the situation. This enables all stressful situations to be managed to some degree. Stress, being a function of both the situation and the person facing the situation, can thus be managed to a large extent by controlling the psychological aspects related to stress. All kinds of stresses in our daily lives demand a significant adjustment on part of the individual. Such adjustments have been studied at different levels, ranging from the macro level, the social and environmental forces, through the mid-level, the psychological appraisals, to micro level, the biological and physiological processes. The relationship between stress and its health outcomes have been studied from social, psychological, and biological perspectives. The social stress perspective studies the different kinds of stresses and their cumulative effects on the health outcomes. For example, the daily hassles and chronic stressors have been evidenced to have the most significant effect on our health and well-being than that of discrete life events. It has been observed that the daily stressors produce spikes in psychological distress during a particular day, while life events create prolonged bouts of distress. Daily stress may also have prolonged health effects when piled up across days, which in turn creates persistent irritations, frustrations, and overloads, including chronic physical and psychological distress, chronic conditions and functional impairment, and even mortality. The accumulation of stressor exposure, or total number of stresses that an individual experiences, is more problematic if the stressors experienced are less diverse. It has been observed by Coffer and the co-workers in 2016 that higher levels of stressor exposure that are accompanied by lower levels of stressor diversity indicate a depletion of specific types of resources and may indicate the chronicity of the stressor. In order to explain how social structures are linked to stressors and health outcomes, the social researchers draw on two hypotheses: the exposure hypothesis and the vulnerability hypothesis. Stressor exposure is the likelihood that a person will be exposed to stressors given her or his social location, such as the socioeconomic status or gender, and individual characteristics such as personality. On the other hand, vulnerability to stressors relates to the concept of reactivity, which is the likelihood that one will show physical or psychological reactions to experienced environmental demands or stressors. There is considerable evidence supporting the idea of differentiated exposure to stressors based on socio-demographic, psychosocial, and situational characteristics as an explanation of why some people are healthier than others. For example, researchers have found that the socioeconomic status, age, personality, and social support play critical roles in differentiating individuals' experiences of stress exposure. Despite being at a risk of being exposed to stressors due to one's social location, the vulnerability hypothesis states that it is the reactivity of an individual that determines his health outcome. Some of the reasons that may buffer an individual from developing a negative health outcome despite being at risk due to his social location, like the lower socioeconomic status, are: the experience of chronic stresses may desensitize individuals with lower SES in their reactions to minor day-to-day stressors, or individuals from lower SES may encounter similar types of daily stressors, indicating a low number of daily stressors encountered and lower levels of daily stressor diversity. The psychological stress perspective focuses on an individual's perception and evaluation of the potential damage caused by external environmental demands and their effects on the health. According to this perspective, the way that we evaluate external events, that is stressors, determines our degree of stress and its important health consequences. The two concepts that are fundamental to the psychological stress perspective are appraisal and coping. The term appraisal refers to the continuous evaluation by individuals of their relationship with the external environment with respect to their implications for well-being. Lazarus also distinguished between primary and secondary appraisal. Primary appraisal refers to the evaluation of whether external events are relevant to one's values, goal commitments, and beliefs about the self and the world, as well as the situational intentions. and stress occurs when external events threaten these key features of well-being during the primary appraisal. Secondary appraisal reflects the evaluative processes that assess resources for dealing with or managing stress. During secondary appraisal, individuals provide judgments about who or what is responsible for a harm, threat, challenge, or benefit in order to place the blame or credit for an outcome. These stress appraisals are followed by coping, which involves specific cognitive and behavioral strategies to manage stressful experiences and their consequences. These cognitive and behavioral strategies adopted by an individual to adjust to stressful events can be either effective or maladaptive, which in turn has important implications on health and well-being of the individual. The strategies adopted by an individual are, to a large extent, determined by the perceptions or cognitive appraisals of the stressors. Even the major moderators of stress coping process are construed in terms of cognitive appraisals. For example, the impact of social resources also depends upon how these resources are perceived. Behavioral changes that occur as adaptations or coping responses have also been found to provide an important pathway to influence the disease risk. For example, increased smoking, decreased exercise and sleep, the poorer adherence to medical regimens have been found to be associated with negative health outcomes. Although stressors are often associated with illness, the majority of individuals confronted with traumatic events and chronic stressors do remain disease-free. There has been considerable interest in identifying the individual differences in vulnerability to the potential pathogenic effects of stress, with emphasis on genetic as well as psychological factors. The biological stress perspective focuses on the acute and long-term physiological changes that result from social stressors and their associated psychological appraisals. It also identifies the linkage of biological responses to stress with different illnesses. Two endocrine system responses that are found to be associated with stress are the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, HPA, and the sympathetic adrenal medullary, or the SAM system. Quick and short-term activation is governed by the SAM system. Activation of SAM releases catecholamines, which work with the autonomic nervous system to regulate the cardiovascular, pulmonary, hepatic, skeletal muscle, and immune systems. Longer-term adaptations are met by the HPA system. HPA activation leads to secretion of the hormone cortisol. It regulates anti-inflammatory responses and is involved in the metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Cortisol is also implicated in gluconeogenesis. Continued and repeated activation of the HPA and SAM systems can disrupt their control over other physiological systems, leading to an increased risk of certain physical and psychological conditions. The exposure to stressors over longer periods of time might lead to lowering of adaptive functioning both in biological and psychological aspects. The lowering of adaptive biological functioning is referred to as biological decompensation, and the lowering of adaptive psychological functioning in response to severe or sustained stressors is referred to as psychological decompensation. The impact of long-term stressors on both biological as well as psychological functioning has been better understood in terms of the general adaptation syndrome by Hans Selye. Selye was one of the first to study the effects of long-term stress on health. He theorized about what is known as the general adaptation syndrome. It refers to the body's response to stressors. Such a response of the body to sustained and excessive stressors occurs in three major phases. The first is alarm reaction. It is the emergency response of the body in which the body's defensive forces are called to arms by the activation of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the second stage is the stage of resistance. If the stressor continues to be present, the resistance begins wherein the body resists the effects of the continuous stressor. The hormonal responses of the body to deal with the long-term adaptation to the stress involve HPA activation. It leads to the secretion of stress hormones like cortisol. Cortisol and other similar hormones allow the body to deal adaptively with stressors by the metabolism of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, as well as gluconeogenesis, and thus providing enough fuel for the body to deal with stress. This process of adaptation to stress or achieving stability through change is referred to as allostasis. Under prolonged stress, the stress adaptation systems, including both the SAM and HPA systems, remain activated and fail to shut down when no longer needed. However, high levels of stress hormones produced by these systems can be harmful. It may deplete the body of the necessary resources needed to maintain immune system and other physiological systems. Such a biological cost of adapting to stress is referred to as the allostatic load. Third, the stage of exhaustion. In the final stage of the general adaptation syndrome, the body's capacity to respond to both continuous and new stressors has been seriously compromised. In addition to the depletion of adaptive resources, the coping patterns called forth in the stage of resistance begin to fail. The individual's ability to deal with the continuous stress is substantially lowered, and he or she may employ exaggerated and inappropriate defensive measures. The reduced immune system and other physiological functions may result in a number of infectious diseases, illnesses like stomach ulcers, diabetes, high blood pressure, and increased susceptibility to certain types of cancers. Chronic stress leads to illnesses through its effects on certain physiological systems that we are going to discuss now. The first is weakened immune system. Prolonged stress inhibits the return to a natural state, with elevated hormone levels wreaking havoc by suppressing the immune system and making the individuals susceptible to illness, disease, and psychological disorders. HPA and SAM hormones bind to and alter the functions of immunologically active cells. The stress hormones deplete the availability of proteins needed for the formation of the white blood cells. Thus, fewer white blood cells are produced and the body is less able to fight infection. Effects of stress on the regulation of immune and inflammatory processes have the potential to influence depression, infectious diseases, autoimmune diseases, and coronary artery diseases, and at least some types of cancers, for example, the virally mediated ones. Now, the second is the damage to DNA. Chronic stress has also been shown to cause DNA damage as minor as graying hair, with pigment-producing cells being impacted, or as serious as tumor development, growth inhibition, metabolic impairments, and miscarriages. Third is increased blood pressure. The exposure to long-term stress and secretion of stress hormones results in increased heart rate and constriction of blood vessels, which leads to increased blood pressure and has been found to be associated with cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, and kidney failure. Now, the fourth is the disrupted brain function. High levels of cortisol can wear down the brain's ability to function properly. According to several studies, chronic stress impairs brain function in multiple ways. It can disrupt synapse regulation, resulting in the loss of sociability and avoidance of interactions with others. stress can kill brain cells and even reduce the size of the brain. Chronic stress has a shrinking effect on the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for memory and learning. While stress can shrink the prefrontal cortex, it can increase the size of the amygdala, which can make the brain more receptive to stress. Therefore, stress is a complex process that produces short-term changes such as physiological and emotional states, as well as long-term alterations on physiological and neuroanatomical level. For example, the prolonged or repeated activation of the HPA and SAM systems interferes with other physiological systems, resulting in increased risk for physical and psychiatric disorders. Associations between psychological stress and disease have been established, particularly for depression, CVD, and HIV/AIDS. Other areas in which the evidence for the role of stress is beginning to emerge include upper respiratory tract infections, asthma, herpes, viral infections, autoimmune diseases, and even wound healing. Numerous studies have linked chronic stress to several health problems, including Parkinson's disease, depression, and pain. Stress has also been found to be associated with diminishing capacity to respond to reward, declines in cognitive function, and disruptions in attentional control of the prefrontal cortex functions. Stress also plays a role in memory process as manifested by the changes in the hippocampus. Specifically, stress levels were found to be positively associated with the hippocampal volume loss. Though stress-illness association has been better understood in the biological perspective, but this association is not always linear. The influence of social and psychological moderators has also been found in the relation of stress to various illnesses. The stress-illness association can thus be better understood by a multi-level analysis of stress and associated processes at the social, psychological, and biological levels. For example, despite being exposed to same levels of stress at the societal level, every individual might not show similar psychological and biological responses, and in turn, similar types or levels of illnesses. Thus, the association between stress and illness is a complex interplay of social, psychological, and biological factors. For example, it has been observed from the social perspective that stressor diversity might play an important role in determining the negative health outcomes. The psychological perspective identifies the importance of several behavioral and cognitive strategies in response to the outside stressors that play an important role in determining the negative health outcomes. Finally, the biological perspective understands the various physiological mechanisms that lead to different kinds of illnesses. That concludes our today's lecture. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.